2020 under, I think, 3 prime ministers and 4 foreign secretaries. And once all that was done and you departed the diplomatic service, you became a member of the House of Lords, and you are now Master of Christ College, Cambridge. So quite the CV, but also, and the theme of our discussion today is not just international affairs, but of course leadership. And I'm sure many of you would have seen Lord McDonald's first book, Leadership, Lessons from a Life in Diplomacy, which has now been followed up with a sequel, Beyond Britannia, Reshaping UK Foreign Policy. So I want to start today really, Simon, by talking about leadership, your past experience of leadership. Everyone leads differently. Everyone manages differently, and of course management and leadership are not to be confused. They overlap sometimes, but they are 2 very different things. How would you describe the style of personal leadership that you developed over your 38 years in the diplomatic service?
The first thing I would emphasize is learning and copying. So I arrived in the Foreign Office as 21, and 21-year-olds think they're grown-ups, and I think they're fully formed. Well, they may be grown up, but they are certainly not fully formed. And so I learned leadership from the people around me. As I said, I was very fortunate with the leaders I came across early in my career. So things I learned from them, maybe, and I'd like to think they were nascent inside, but they were definitely cultivated by my first leaders, were one about interest in the team and the issues. I'm afraid they were all men, but we are talking about.
You talk about that in your book.
And that was just the world 40 years ago. But they were all immensely interested in the people around them. So nobody was just a drafter or a gopher or someone to be instructed. We were all people to get to know and to be helped. So that was a big learning. My first ambassador then went on to be in the US, and indeed my father-in-law. So he is a very influential person in my life. But he was the most human, relatable leader I ever worked for. Second thing was they all were very, very interested in the subjects they were dealing with. And I don't think this was feigned, but when you are dealing with thorny issues, to take a deep interest, a positive interest, I think helps you and the team around you grapple successfully. Thirdly, they were very rigorous. They were not superficial. They were not put off by little setbacks. They didn't stop to talk themselves. There was no happy talk around what we were doing. We looked at the problems squarely, and and the team was a safe space to discuss all the disagreeable stuff. Of course, what you present up the chain, what you present externally, needs a bit of work sometimes, but it is absolutely vital that you have that rigor around you. And the last thing from all of the above is the atmosphere was fun. There was a lightness which just meant that everybody looked forward to going to work. And I learned that early, and I tried to apply that later.
And you didn't ever sort of during your time in the I know the diplomatic service is separate from the home civil service, but you didn't sort of think, oh, I wish I was a culture or transport.
Never.
No, you always...
I worked out as a teenager that I wanted to live overseas. I wanted to deal with international relations. I mean, it's partly because I'm from Salford, which is in the northwest of England, and when I was a kid, it was one of the most depressed towns in the country. So an escape from the town was quite important to me personally. The only thing I can remember, the only time Salford hit the headlines in the 1970s was in an edition of the Guinness Book of Records, when it was revealed that Salford had the highest death rate in Europe because of the mines, the industries that were there. It was, it was
But much transport
rate and dying. And now I date the transformation from the day I left.
Okay.
So it's now a vibrant media city, the Lowry Centre, and I was there about a month ago. And there's very little I recognise from my childhood, but frankly, that's a good thing.
Just turning back to your early days at the then Foreign and Commonwealth Office, you use this wonderful phrase in the book, presumed competence, which describes how you were treated as a junior employee at the FCO. What kind of impact do you think this approach had on your own personal development and your later approach as a manager?
Well, hugely significant, because I worked out that I was trusted. And so when you know that the draft you present is going to be used, that the presentation you give will be listened to and acted upon, you feel a sense of ownership and responsibility. Some bosses don't create that, they rip up the pieces of work that are given, they start from scratch, they question everything. I was not treated like that, and I found that immensely empowering. So it gave me greater pride in the work. I knew, it wasn't necessarily a piece of work that was going to change the price of fish, but it was something that would go into the department. It would be read by decision makers in head office, and it was down to me to get the basics right. As I say, I think that it made the work more worthwhile. And then later on, I discovered that if that is how you treat people, if you trust people, then it's better for you. Sure. No, part of the team is two-way communication. So if I didn't know something, or it wasn't clear what the instruction was, my bosses would help. They would expect me to come along and ask questions. And so that by the time I presented a piece of work, there had been enough context for me to be confident that this was what was required.
Which leads me to the first of our questions from our viewers today, which was sent in advance, this one. It's from Priscilla Minder, and she asks, what advice would you give a younger version of yourself? That classic question.
No, it's not the first time I've had this question. My answer now is, don't be daunted. That I as a 20-year-old, was quite sort of hesitant to offer a personal view, because I just assumed that everybody else was more experienced and that what they'd have to say was more valuable. Well, it was true that they were more experienced, but it wasn't necessarily true that what they had to say would be, in a given context, more valuable. So it's essential that the boss is creating a safe space, but in that safe space, more junior colleagues have I urge them to have the confidence to speak up.
And Priscilla also asked, which is a question I've heard before, because people, they sort of know about how you get into the domestic civil service, but how does one become a diplomat? Like your teenage self in Salford, and you're like, I quite fancy travelling and being in public service. And has the entry system changed enormously from 1982 to now?
Not massively. You have to apply.
Yeah.
The Civil Service Commission runs the entrance for the diplomatic service. It's the Home Civil Service. So everything is online, including test papers. So you can sort of test yourself in advance.
Yeah.
You have to monitor the website, because there's a window that opens for applications and it closes. So do your prep. Pay attention to the information online and go for it. And my other piece of advice is, if this is really what you want to do, go for it more than once if the first effort doesn't work out, because it's a very, very popular job for graduates.
Yes.
And the only qualification is an honours degree. We don't specify the class, it's just that you have to have a degree. Which means that there are many thousands of applications for tens of places. So what any employer does in these circumstances is apply a very fine filter very early on. And as an employer, you reconcile yourself to the possibility that the very best 50 are excluded in that fine filter. But you do that because you know you'll still have a very good pool to choose from.
I'm sure there's been another spike in applicants last year. The diplomatic world had its very own West Wing in the form of Netflix's The Diplomat, which I'm sure you watched.
In every way, apart from a very wonderful set and
Yes.
a rather attractive principal there, but the story and the presentation were just ludicrous.
That's really a question for our friends of the American embassy round the corner. Fast forward to your time as permanent Under Secretary of State. Get it right this time, and actually, my deliberate mistake earlier, which is partly due to having worked with the politicians rather than people like yourself for too many years, is it's not that people go, especially at the senior levels, stuff. How do you sum up the difference in the role at the most basic level between the permanent secretary, permanent Under Secretary of State, and the actual mere Secretary of State? What's the? Because sometimes I think, even though one is usually famous and on the TV a lot, usually getting shouted at these days, and the other is more in the shadows, how do you sort of sum up the difference in the responsibilities?
I'm a historian, so my explanation comes from history. The Foreign Office and the Home Office were set up in 1782. And in charge of both was someone called the Secretary of State, and the number 2 in both these new departments called the Under Secretary of State. Made sense. And this situation persisted for about half a century. And then in sort of the second quarter of the 19th century, people thought the work is getting more. The departments are busier. We need more than one deputy. And so there were 2 were carved out of the single job. And the distinction between the 2 was somebody who would be in Parliament, political, who would be close to the Foreign Secretary in the party, and that was the Parliamentary Under Secretary. And the other was someone who would be there through a change in administration. So not so close personally to the big boss, but someone running the machine and providing continuity. The name, the adjective they chose was permanent. So that has persisted now for nearly 200 years. And over time, this division that was to do with workload has solidified. And we had very big civil service reforms in the 1860s, and we've had repeated reforms in the 20th century, where and we now, as a country, have an independent civil service and diplomatic service, which services the government of the day, whatever its political complexion. So I was part of that machine, permanent, helping the government, advising the government, and the politicians were the people chosen at general elections, and they were the people taking the decisions.
This department on the Foreign Secretary working list. So it is always fascinating to see the way the politicians, quite rightly in a democracy, are don't have to demonstrate expertise or experience, but then the sort of rigorous
Yeah, but it's
selection.
An interesting example you choose, because Ernest Bevin was one of, if not the greatest Foreign Secretary of the 20th century. So you don't need to be somebody who has
different skills and responsibilities.
Your life. Yeah. Exactly, it's a different skill set. And Bevin's he had many strengths, but one of them was seeing a political way through. One of the most important speeches made after the Second World War was by Dean Acheson about how to help Europe. But it was Bevin who took hold of this and helped create the Marshall Plan. The Americans had a sort of a theoretical idea, but it was the British Foreign Secretary who helped turn it into reality.
Acheson, I think, said we'd lost an empire. But
sorry, it was Marshall first. Acheson came slightly later.
Yeah, and we'd failed to find a new role. But
that's still...
And that's something we'll come on to later, because obviously Britain did have a particular role from the Second World War. And now there's some talk about slightly reshaping that and refocusing that. But I do have a couple more questions related to leadership before we move to those interesting topics. As Permanent Secretary, in terms of being a leader, what were sort of, you think, were the leading or problems that you face leading a large organisation like the FCDO? Because you've got, is it about 17,000 staff, and many of whom are based in almost every country on the planet. So
it's true, and so it's something I felt on my very first day as PUS. That you sit in a corner office in London overlooking St James's Park. It's very nice, but you're kind of cut off from most of the people you are working with. At the time, it was 14,000. It's now about 17,000 because of the combination with Department for International Development. So when I was there, 14,000 people working in 170 countries and territories in 270 different cities. So, spread across every time zone. And I thought, how on earth do I make people in Wellington and Asunción and San Francisco think that they are working with me? And the two devices I used as PUS were one, a blog and direct communications with the team, and I was hugely assisted by our technology.
Yes.
Because wherever you are in the FCO, as it then was, when you fire up your work computer, you get a home page. And as PUS, I had the most desirable bit of real estate, which was the top right-hand corner. And so that's where my blog appeared every week. I did 3 weeks out of 4. There was a guest blog on the 4th week, so it gave me time to breathe. And over 4 years, that accumulated, I think, quite a large readership across the whole organisation. The other thing I did was visit. I visited every department in London, every directorate, and over 5 years I visited 124 posts overseas. So, being seen in person. Now, the fact that you're coming, the fact that there's follow-up, also helps you connect with the team.
Yeah, so it's not just the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs who has to do every time you turn the news on, look cameras in a different country.
His agenda is always driven by the top items in the news. I mean, sometimes they can do other travel, but usually it's associated with a meeting that they have to go to, like the G20 or the G7. So David Cameron was this spring in Paraguay, first time the British Foreign Secretary had been there, and he went to the Falkland Islands because there was a huge meeting which he had to attend in Brazil. So when you're in the neighbourhood, you maximise the benefit of your time away. But his travel is very much more driven by the big problems that my travel could complement his. So go to places less visited, less in the headlines, and so we never tripped over each other.
Yes, no, I understand. You mentioned technology, and obviously one of the things that's changed radically in the last few years is the rise and importance of social media. There's no more tuning into the wireless to get the news from London once or twice a day. It's 24/7. But also, more importantly, not just the pace of the news, it's the quality of the news and the outlets. How do you think social media and technology is making it more difficult to lead, both in terms, not just in terms of foreign policy, but generally in government.
Yeah, it in many ways it's making life more complicated. It's more difficult to sift truth from falsehood than ever before. There's fakery is everywhere. For me, one startling moment was last year, just as ChatGPT-4 appeared, which was March last year, and all the papers had a front page picture of Pope Francis wearing a Balenciaga white puffer jacket. He looked pretty cool, I have to say. And it was completely convincing and a bit unusual. So lots of news outlets ran it. Within a week, it was revealed it was a total.
No, not a real picture.
And so you think, oh my God, can I trust any image anymore? And the answer to that is no, you can't. You have to have ways of checking. Now, there are better and better ways of checking. Some of the fakery is just hilarious and treasurable. If anyone in the audience has not seen the rap of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin doing a version of "It Wasn't Me," I recommend that.
Yeah.
You know immediately it's not the two guys themselves. You also see the very high production values that it's very cleverly done. So you've got to think, if I know this is a fake, but this could be used with people I don't know on a story I'm not familiar with, so I've got to question everything.
There was a tweet of a picture, I think, yesterday from a Conservative member of Parliament of the new Russian defence minister, but it was mocked up from the Death of Stalin comedy film. It was really Jason Isaacs with the new defence minister's face, and I think some people were fooled by that for a bit. I'm just going to turn, before we get some questions in from people watching, just onto foreign policy more particularly. So obviously there's been some huge historic events in recent years affecting the UK and Europe, most particularly Brexit, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I'm interested in getting your take on the UK's changing role in the world. And do you think it's still a realistic goal for the UK to be a world leader? Or do you think, as was mentioned, and I'll come to this report from the UCL Policy Lab recently, we need to sort of reevaluate somewhat and accept a slightly different role from the one we were used to from after World War II to the end of the Cold War?
We absolutely need to re-evaluate, and that indeed is the subject of my second book, Beyond Britannia. So it's a 250-page essay on how we should change the emphasis. And I think we can still play an important role. It will very rarely be a leadership role classically defined. We're not going to be sending conquering armies anymore anywhere. We won't be using hard power in the way that we have been used to. But soft power is the real thing. And I think the United Kingdom has a lot to offer as an example humbly offered of how to deal with quite a lot of the challenges of governments and society in the 21st century.
And you mentioned soft power, and I know you talk about this more in your second book, but if you could sort of give, 2 or 3 examples of Britain's greatest, soft power. And do you think, actually, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the defence budget? Should the government also have an aspiration to spend a percentage of national income on soft power?
A couple of things. First, I'll give 3 examples. The best example for me of our soft power is our judiciary, the rule of law. And the best demonstration of this, I think, is the fact that the rest of the world comes to London for arbitration. So if companies or states are in a legal dispute, this is the favoured jurisdiction. British lawyers and judges are trusted to work methodically, objectively through the evidence and come up with a robust judgment. And this time and again, you'll see that very big countries, very big companies are in the UK using British legal expertise on both sides in order to make their case. That is an endorsement where billions of dollars are at stake, is a real endorsement. So our judiciary, I think, is our most appealing aspect of soft power. Second is our university system. And linked to that are niche expert science and engineering, which are extremely impressive. We generate more unicorns, these new technology companies than any other country in Europe, probably more than all the other countries in Europe put together. And Oxford and Cambridge and the London universities, this sort of triangle in the heart of England is the heart of that offer. And the third is a bit of cheat, because I will mimic the departmental name: culture, media, and sport. These are all, I think, very highly developed in the UK, very appealing to the rest of the world in the UK. One example is the fact that Netflix uses the UK for much of its billions of dollars through production companies producing original content for their streaming service. One of the biggest blockbusters of the year will be released when we have the third series of Bridgerton.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
All done in the UK.
Yeah.
And with sport, the Premier League is by far the most watched in the world. It's as popular in East Asia as it is in Western Europe. And our media is still the most trusted outside its own territory. So the FT and the Economist, the Guardian, and the BBC are points of reference in many other countries. And that is unusual and needs to be, I think, celebrated and protected.
Yeah, I mean, often when that question is asked, the BBC is, quite high up in people's lists of. It's interesting, as you say, some of these media outlets are probably more respected abroad than they are at home when they get caught up in the day-to-day political battle. Which leads me to the Prime Minister's speech earlier this week, where he talked about some of the threats faced by the UK. And without getting into the party politics of it, do you think this is actually going to be one of those rare elections where foreign policy is going to be much more talked about, going to have more of an impact on not just the news coverage, but actually determining people's votes come election day?
No.
No.
No, it's going to be domestic stuff.
Yeah.
It's going to be
Bill Clinton.
the cost of
It's the economy.
the cost of living crisis. It's going to be scandals in politics. There's a lot of domestic heavy stuff. The one foreign story which I think might break through is the US presidential election. Because if the next president is Donald Trump, I think everybody's going to be.
Well, that leads me to my next question. So, yeah, please elaborate on how you think his second term in the White House, should he get that in November, could be different.
That is a key rider, Jonathan. That the election is on the 5th of November. It's down to two people, but we absolutely don't know who will win. But given it's down to two people, we should be thinking about the consequences of either man in the White House for 4 more years. Donald Trump will be the most challenging president domestically and internationally in the history of the Republic. And he has a whole term's experience to draw on in a second administration. He was very frustrated first time round. He was very frustrated by inertia in the system. He appointed quite a lot of people that he didn't really know because he was advised to, and they didn't last very long, but months and years went by. This time, I think he'll have a team, a very loyal team, ready from week one. And this time I suspect his methods will be much more confident and brutal. So he's likely to sack a lot of people and just see what happens next.
Yes.
On the international stage, he's very skeptical of NATO. There may be immediate consequences for Europe out of that skepticism. He thinks he can do a deal with Putin over Ukraine. There could be very quick consequences for Ukraine if that is his choice. The relationship with China will be immediately more confrontation. His policies towards the climate will be much more forgiving to big oil. So a lot could change very, very quickly. And I think people have a sense of that.
Yes.
So if that is the result on the 5th of November and the election is after the 5th of November, I would expect that to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
The incumbent Prime Minister will try to present himself as someone who's tried and tested and a safe pair of hands in this uncertain world. The leader of the opposition will be saying, this is the moment where we need a change to deal with such a big challenge.
We have a scenario. I mean, one of the favourite dates for the British general election is the 14th of November, the King's birthday. And yeah, of course, a week and 2 days after America decides. So we'll have an impact, as you say. Before we move to questions from people watching, I thought I would just ask a bit about your thoughts on reform of British institutions. First of all, on the civil service itself, how do you think the civil service, or do you think it's getting it right when it comes to civil service senior positions recruitment, or do you think there's some changes that would be helpful there?
I think it's getting it largely right, but it's clearly not getting it completely right. I think that the independence from the political leaders of the day has been eroded in recent times, that number 10, the special advisors, cabinet ministers are leaning further and further into recruitment processes. I think that is a bad thing. And one thing that follows from that behaviour in recent times is a new set of ministers is going to have more reason to question the impartiality of the senior civil service, when so many of them have clearly been placed there by particular ministers rather than by a civil service process. So I think this will be a good moment to reconnect with some of the historic values of impartiality and objectivity and excellence, rather than who gruntles a particular minister most enthusiastically.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel? So we've had a couple of cases recently where you always have to take press reports with a pinch of salt, but over Rwanda, and also I think it was arms sales to Israel, that officials were unhappy, and you must have had situations. How do you best navigate?
One thing that's in recent times is the assumption that civil servants are not in the media. So they are in the media both as a target of attack, but also as a source for stories. This is not a way, I submit, that civil servants should behave. If you have unhappiness in the system, you raise it within the system with your permanent secretary. You don't go and find a friendly journalist that will carry your story without your name. I think that is the wrong way for civil servants to behave. So, this cuts both ways.
Yeah.
I think ministers need to behave in a different way, and so do civil servants. The key about the unhappiness you mentioned is, are you able to make your case? Civil service tradition is you advise about fear or favour. So, is your advice in front of the minister before she or he takes the decision? If it is, and they go a different way, well, so what? You have done your job. And second, decision coming out of the process, are they lawful or not? And if they are, well, then your job is to get on and do it. I mean, occasionally something is so deeply personal that it becomes a resignation issue. I worked in the diplomatic service for 38 years, and there was one resignation. So it's strange, but also strangely rare. One of the difficult things I had to do as a secretary was to kind of go where some of the things that I was asking them to do were not lawful. But then that's not a matter for individual civil servants. That's a matter for the whole service, led by the permanent secretaries. So this stories of unhappiness about detailed policy, I don't have a lot of sympathy.
Right. And I do want to ask you about the recent report from the UCL Policy Lab from Tom Fletcher, Mozan Malik and Lord Sedwell, former Cabinet Secretary. It got quite a bit of coverage. And I was interested because then I actually read the report. There's like one paragraph that talks about we need to change the name of the foreign office, it reaches the past of the leases and the buildings so old-fashioned, we need to change the artwork. As the headlines. Most of the report focused on some of the more substantive issues about Britain in the 21st century and you know what the world will look like in 2040. But of course, I mean, I don't know, maybe the authors did it deliberately to ensure that, you know, that's written about, or did they fall into that trap of just don't go near paintings and you know, traditional things, just focus on substance.
It was very interesting seeing the difference between the headlines and the substance of the report. Most of the substance I had no problem with, indeed endorsed, indeed wrote before they did in my book, if I may say so. But the things that grab their headlines, I disagree with. I think it would be crazy to demolish the building, crazy to change the name, because you can't run away from your past.
No.
It's we need to understand our past clearly. We need to live down our past in some ways, but to cancel it, if you like, I don't think is a sensible option. So this Department for International Affairs just sounds to me like, yes, minister, which had a department, administrative affairs. There's no spice. There's no connection with either the people working in the organisation or the history of the country that they are representing. So it absolutely grabbed headlines, but I don't think it was the best or best argued bit of the report.
Well, we shall see over the next few years if any of the recommendations are taken forward. But no, it's certainly, you know, my feelings were somewhat similar to yours. Now we have some questions from our viewers this afternoon, if you don't mind me calling you that. Now we have a question from Michelle. She's asked you actually something you've already talked about. Who were your role models? Which was in you cover in the book. Who were your role models when you were younger, and who are your role models now, if you're able to say? And also, what has been one of the most difficult challenges you've ever had to face as a leader? And that's a question from Michelle.
Well, the role models in my early career I do talk about in the book, and I've already mentioned one who was Patrick Wright, who was my first ambassador. A second is Jeremy Greenstock, who was in the embassy, my first embassy, later became political director and our permanent representative in New York, so rose right to the top of the service. And the third was a man called David Gilmore, and he was permanent secretary when I worked as private secretary to the permanent undersecretary, and they embodied all those humane qualities that I was talking about at the beginning, and it was just an immense privilege to be in their vicinity. Now, I mean, I come across lots of people I admire. The first one who pops into my head is David Anderson. David Anderson is a crossbench here. He used to be the information or the intelligence commissioner, and he sort of coordinated crossbench efforts dealing with the Rwanda bill. Now, I do not like the safety of the Rwanda bill. I do not like it because I do not think it can possibly work. I think the government has misunderstood what deterrence means, and I think it will waste a huge amount of public money. I got quite heated about this. David Anderson was always calm. You know, if you look him up in Hansard, you will see that every intervention is measured and necessary.
Very House of Lords.
Very much.
Absolutely. That's how you win arguments there. Yeah, yeah. So I also have a question from Sophia. This is a very good one. If you had to state three distinct qualities in leaders that most inspired you in your life and career, what would they be? And I know you touched on that earlier.
Well, to have another run at it, I think they all had, in the broadest, most flexible sense, a plan. They knew what they wanted to do in the job they were doing, and they knew where their team fitted in. Second thing, the team. None of these characters was a lone wolf. None of them was trying to do everything by herself, himself. I think that's also crucial. Looking after the team, giving the team credit, developing the team. All the best leaders all do that. And the third quality was being decent human beings.
Yeah,
they were kind people. You know, they were people who knew you had a life outside the office, knew you had other pressures, gave you time when you needed it, knew there was such a thing as a bad day. A bad day is an inconvenient moment for the office, but could cope with all that. So they were people who always had 5 minutes for you, no matter what else was going on. And that human side, I think, is very important to leader.
I do often wonder, I mean, work-life balance is something that increasingly is talked about in relation, not just to younger people entering the workforce, but more generally. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember when a computer was just a flickery thing in the corner of the room on a filing cabinet that occasionally people put some numbers into. But now you do sort of feel a lot more on call 24/7. But I often wonder, because, you know, from my time working in politics and government, how on earth did it all work before you even had email? You know, all these constant messages flying around, submissions.
For this reason, I wonder if the concept of work-life balance is still helpful. Because so much of life is blended, or so many borders are fuzzy, that it's you know, making sure you have time to do all the things that you want to do. And that can mean that when you're not working, there's a bit of your brain is still thinking about work because you can't turn that bit of the brain off. Or it can mean that when you are at work, you drop out for an hour or two because there's something else that you have to do. So the work and play and home are sort of more of a continuum than they used to be, because, as you point out, technology allows them to be very closely connected. When I started work, nobody had email.
No.
You know, we wrote letters to embassies overseas, and they went by a diplomatic bag that could take 6 weeks to get there. So it was, things were very separated in that era, and they're not separated anymore.
Very much not. Question from Avrind. Does the change management in public sector ensure the growth of people with their strengths?
Well, you see, you've got to look at your own context, I think, because I don't know. I worked in a bit of the public sector, and I can imagine it's quite patchy across a civil service of 400,000 people. So I would hesitate to give an answer.
No, I understand. Yeah.
Generally.
Question from Aisha, who works on foreign affairs and defence policy in the Scotland office. What do you think the key role is for territorial offices working on reserve matters, defence, national security and foreign affairs? What role do you think they should play vis-a-vis?
Well, they are reserved matters. And in retirement, I am absolutely a proud unionist. I think the union is a vital part of our whole country. I think the union needs to prove its value to the other nations in the union, to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But they're reserved for a reason. So the London and Westminster will lead, but Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland will have a shout, will have an input. And when there is something particular that's a Scottish interest, Welsh interest, Northern Irish interest, then they make the point, find ways in. But but I think in order to land, it has to be specifically relevant, not just a general observation that anybody could make, because. So if I were in Edinburgh, Cardiff, or or Belfast, I'd be prioritising where I used my limited resources rather than trying to do London to job.
Yes, yes. Question here again from Priscilla. Would you say that diplomacy has lacked effectiveness in recent years? And we see some of the results of that. And by recent years, I think we can look at a broader span of decades. Russia, Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. Has there been a failure of diplomacy, or just forces sometimes, just make diplomacy impossible?
Well,
sorry, I think
diplomats justify their existence by helping to keep the peace. And although there are many conflicts raging around the world, overall, the world is more peaceful than it has ever been. So, people are very much more knowledgeable about those conflicts which do rage. So I completely understand the question, but taking a step back, they still think diplomacy has, on balance, succeeded more than failed. And taking the 40-year sweep, I look at the end of the Cold War, and then a group of countries to the east of our continent became free, and they remained free, and I think that is a huge plus. But diplomacy clearly has been totally successful. What's happening in Ukraine is a failure of diplomacy. What's happening in the Middle East is a failure of diplomacy. What's happening in a dozen places in Africa is a failure of diplomacy. But if we're judged only by our failures, we will be very depressed.
And former American Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was talking the other day. I think she was trying to she was talking about how close her husband, former President Clinton, came to reaching an agreement when it was Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat in about 93, I think. So that just shows how diplomacy can.
My grandmother used to have a phrase: "A miss is as good as a mile," and I'm afraid the key is that he didn't.
No,
sadly.
Do you have you've also spoken today about how you're also a historian, as well as a professional diplomat. Do you have a favourite diplomat from history? I thought this might be a good, as we come towards the end, a good way to.
It's a very everybody interesting is a mixed proposition, especially when they lived more than 100 years ago. But in British diplomacy, I always was particularly interested in Palmerston, because he was there as the United Kingdom became a confident international player, particularly in Europe. And my little tribute to Lord Palmerston was naming the office cat.
Oh, yes, very important. Yeah. I'm just going to take another question here from Randir Kilachern. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Apologies if I didn't. The public service is characterised by an arsenal of laws devolving into a set of stringent rules and processes. How does one in such a constrained environment shift from the traditional role of an administrator to that of a leader to create an ecosystem fostering innovations, agility, employee motivation, and creativity for a new service paradigm? So that reads quite.
No, it does. I mean, it's quite the question, quite the vocabulary.
Yes.
But it's very, very important. The problem these days is everything is tabulated, everything is written down, and every possible quirk is allegedly dealt with in regulation. Second problem is, comprehensive though it tries to be, it doesn't actually do the job. So I think that leaders need to look at the requirements put on them, prioritize them, and have a story to tell if challenged by why they're not doing certain things, and then just get on with the job as they see it. It involves a certain assessment of risk, a certain acceptance of risk. But if you can't cope with risk, if you can't prioritize between what a book of regulations is telling you to do and what you see the job actually requires, then I think you'll sink.
But I was going to ask you about international obligations. Climate change is obviously a huge issue, not just here, but across the globe. Do you think party politics is making it more difficult for...
But I hope that is not the case. I think it would be a complete tragedy for the planet, climate in particular, to become a party political issue. This is so important to our future. The decisions we take in the next decades will impact the whole planet for all time. That really this, above any other policy area, needs not only cross-party agreement, but international agreement. The COP conferences of the party, have become enormous circuses, which is becoming a bit of a problem when 70,000 people descend on the city.
Becoming like a new Davos, almost. It's the place to be.
And it's against the ethos. I mean, clearly people are burning a lot of fossil fuels to get to these destinations.
On their private jet.
But the one good thing is that it demonstrates the whole world is thinking about something of critical importance. When things are that important, we really have to take them out of party politics.
Yes, I mean, I think there was COP, was it 26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago, and since then it does seem to have become something that's far more talked about. Not the issue itself, that's been talked about for a long time, but the actual annual events. You mentioned cross-party agreement. Another issue that people often think cross-party agreement, and I'm going to ask you this, and I asked Francis Moore the same question about the future of the House of Lords. But I know in your chapter on reform in your book, you devoted more time to talking about the House of Lords, and I think you did the civil service and other things. So could you summarise, maybe in fewer words than in your book, your plan for the House of Lords?
Well, it's too big. So my plan is to make it smaller and more representative of the country, whilst preserving both its expertise, which I think is vital, and its subordinate role to the House of Commons. People forget that most proposals for Lords reform founder in the House of Commons, not in the Lords, because the House of Commons really doesn't want a competitor. So my idea involves reducing its membership by 50%. At the moment, we're about 800. I think it can be no more than 400, and having an element that is expert, so the crossbenchers preserved, about 100, 120 people there, and having an element that is indirectly elected. So we would continue to have only one vote at a general election. It would directly elect a member of parliament for the Commons, and would indirectly select a regional peer. So the United Kingdom would be divided into 10 different regions. The nations of Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland would be 3 of those regions, and each of those 10 regions would have 20 peers representing them as voting members of the House of Lords. And I think that would be more democratic, it would be closer to the people, but it would preserve the traditional role of expert advice.
see the outcome of the election.
It won't happen, but I predict that if there is a Labour government, the House of Lords will become smaller because the hereditaries will probably go, and people who have not attended very much will probably leave as well.
Yes, I mean, whenever the size of the House of Lords is talked about, one of the problems is how would you reduce that size? And this actually leads to a question from Sophia. She's not talking about the House of the Lords, but she's talking about people you consider leaders in history, whether they're living or not. Who would you hire? Just name three. Who would you hire, fire, and redeploy?
I would hire. She was a remarkable leader. She was modest, and she also ran the tightest, most effective government machine I saw in 38 years. I would fire in anticipation Donald Trump. I think the world, speaking as a private citizen, that although he is good on some issues, he's curiously good on nuclear matters. He doesn't like nuclear. That's a good instinct. But overall, I think is somebody that a presence that we're better without. And redeploy. Well, who would I redeploy? I think I'd probably redeploy Jacinda Ardern out of retirement to be Secretary General of the United Nations.
Interesting. Probably that would be quite popular with lots of people, I would have thought. With the increasing complexity of global challenges, how do you see the role of diplomacy evolving in the coming years, and what leadership strategies will be most critical in navigating these challenges?
Ever since new technologies began appearing in the 19th century, diplomacy has had to re-justify itself, I think, every generation. And it's happening again because people are so much more knowledgeable than in the past. They have so much easier access to the rest of the world as they sit in their bedroom or their study. But diplomats, good diplomats, can not only distinguish truth from falsehood, they can winnow out secondary from really important. And so when we are, dealing with foreign countries, trying to understand them, trying to get them to do things we need them to do, some things they don't want to do necessarily, having people who have deep knowledge of those countries is vital to that effort. And I think the best British diplomats have always done that and will continue to do that.
And you talk in your book about in governmental life, sometimes people's ambitions outstrip their ability. This is often a criticism used of some politicians. But does the civil service, do you think, have a similar problem?
Oh, yes. Yes.
But given the vigorous recruitment,
it doesn't. No recruitment or promotion process is immune from this phenomenon. People, it's called the Peter Principle, and people are promoted to their level of incompetence, or people are given one promotion too many, and that afflicts the civil service as well as every other walk of life. I think the civil service needs to be honest about that, to be mindful of that. And to be prepared to move even quite senior people on if they're not doing the job.
Well, I think that's a good place to end this afternoon's conversation. Can I just thank Lord McDonald for being so generous with his time, his openness. I found it absolutely fascinating. I hope you all have as well. And do look out for news of our next In Conversation, which will be, as usual, on our website. So thank you for joining us, wherever you are in the world. Absolute pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.